Hey everybody! Welcome to day 5 of our virtual book study. We are going to be reading chapter 5 today, titled The Good/Bad Binary. I really hope that you guys have all been able to watch all the videos. I know some of them are long, but even just playing in your car while you're taking a drive or even breaking it up into smaller pieces. But it's so important to get through the whole book and not just part of it, because I'm noticing as I'm reading that each chapter really builds on the next chapter. And there's just so much for us to learn. So make sure, try and be accountable to yourself while educating yourself, just to make sure that you can get the most out of this book, because this is a really awesome book. All right, let's go ahead and start. Chapter 5, The Good/Bad Binary. He's not a racist. He is a really nice guy. This chapter explores what is perhaps the most effective adaptation of racism in recent history, the good/bad binary. Prior to the civil rights movement, it was socially acceptable for white people to openly proclaim that their belief in their social superiority. But when white Northerners saw the violence Black people, including women and children, endured during the civil rights protests, they were appalled. These images became the archetypes of racists. After the civil rights movement, to be a good moral person and to be complicit with racism became mutually exclusive. You could not be a good person and participate in racism. Only bad people were racist. These images of Black persecution in the South during the civil rights movement of the 1960s also allowed Northern whites to position racists as always Southern. To accomplish this adaptation, racism first needed to be reduced to simply isolated and extreme acts of prejudice. These acts must be intentional, malicious, and based on conscious dislike of someone because of race. Racists were those white people in the South smiling and picnicking at the base of lynching trees, store owners posting whites-only signs over drinking fountains, and good old boys beating innocent children, such as Emmett Till, to death. In other words, racists were mean, ignorant, old, uneducated Southern whites. Nice people, well-intended people, open-minded middle-class people, people raised in the, quote, enlightened North, could not be racist. Racist equals bad, ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, old Southern. Not racist equals good, progressive, educated, open-minded, well-intentioned, young Northern. While making racism bad seems like a positive change, we have to look at how this functions in practice. Within this paradigm, to suggest that I am racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character, and that is where all my energy will go, to deflecting the charge, rather than reflecting on my behavior. In this way, the good/bad binary makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. What it is, how it shapes all of us, and the inevitable ways that we are conditioned to participate in it. If we cannot discuss these dynamics of ourselves or see ourselves within them, we cannot stop participating in racism. The good/bad binary made it effectively impossible for the average white person to understand, much less interpret racism. As African-American scholar and filmmaker Omowale Akintunde says, racism is a systemic, societal, institutional, omnipresent, and epistemologically embedded phenomenon that pervades every vestige of our reality. For most whites, however, racism is like murder. The concept exists, but someone has to commit it in order for it to happen. This limited view on such a multi-layered syndrome cultivates the sinister nature of racism, and in fact, perpetuates racist phenomena rather than eradicates them. The good/bad frame is also a false dichotomy. All people hold prejudices. especially across racial lines in a society deeply divided by race. I can be told that everyone is equal by my parents. I can have friends of color, and I may not tell racist jokes. Yet, I am still affected by the forces of racism as a member of society in which racism is the bedrock. I will still be seen as white, treated as white, and experience life as a white person. My identity, personality, interests, and investments will develop from a white perspective. I will have a white worldview and a white frame of reference. In a society in which race clearly matters, our race profoundly shapes us. If we want to challenge this construct, we must make an honest accounting of how it is manifested in our own lives and in the society around us. Although individual racist acts do occur, these acts are part of a larger system of interlocking dynamics. The focus on individual incidences masks the personal, interpersonal, cultural, historical, and structural analysis that is necessary to challenge the larger system. The simplistic idea that racism is limited to individual intentional acts committed by unkind people is at the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. To move beyond defensiveness, we have to let go of this common belief. The good/bad binary certainly obscures the structural nature of racism and makes it difficult for us to see or understand. Equally problematic is the impact of such a worldview on our actions. If as a white person I conceptualize racism as a binary and I place myself on the not racist side, what further action is required of me? No action is required because I am not a racist. Therefore, racism is not my problem. It doesn't concern me, and there's nothing further I need to do. This worldview guarantees that I will not build my skills in thinking critically about racism or use my position to challenge racial inequality. The good/bad binary is at play virtually every day in my work as a consultant on issues of racial justice. My job is to help individuals and organizations see how racism is manifesting itself in their practices and outcomes. I am typically received well when speaking in general terms. For example, quote, "Your requirement that applicants have an advanced degree rather than equivalent experience is automatically disqualifying some of the applicants that could bring the perspectives and experiences you say you are looking for," end quote. Yet, when I point out a concrete moment in the room in which someone's racism is manifesting itself, white fragility erupts. For example, I was working with a group of educators who had been meeting regularly for at least 8 sessions. The group was composed of the equity teams for a public school system, self-selected by people who wanted to support equity efforts in their schools. I just finished an hour-long presentation titled "Seeing the Water: Whiteness in Daily Life." This presentation is designed to make visible the relentless messages of white superiority and the resulting and inevitable internalization of these messages for white people. The room appeared to be with me, open and receptive, with many nodding along in agreement. Then a white teacher raised her hand and told a story about an interaction she had as she drove alongside a group of parents protesting the achievement gap in her school. She then proceeded to imitate one mother in particular who offended her. Quote, "You don't understand our children," this mother had called out to her as she drove by. By the stereotypical way that the white teacher imitated the mother, we all knew that the mother was black. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath at her imitation, which was bordering on racial mockery. While the teacher's concluding point was that, on reflection, she came to realize that the mother was right, and that she really didn't understand children of color. The emotional thrust of the story was her umbrage at the mother for making this assumption. For the room, the emotional impact was on her stereotypical imitation of an angry black woman. As this story came to a close, I had a decision to make. Should I act with integrity and point out what was racially problematic about the story? After all, making racism visible was literally what I had been hired to do. Furthermore, Several African American teachers in the room had certainly noticed the reinforcement of a racist stereotype. To not intervene would be, yet again, another white person choosing to protect white feelings rather than interrupt racism. A white person who billed herself as a racial justice consultant, no less. Yet I would be taking the risk of losing the group, given the likelihood that the woman would become defensive and shut down, and the room would split into those who thought I had mistreated her and those who didn't. I decided to do what would retain my morale and professional integrity and serve as a model for other white people. As diplomatically as possible, I said, I understand that you gained valuable insight from that interaction, and I thank you for sharing that insight with us. And I am going to ask you to consider not telling that story in that way again. When she immediately began to protest, I interrupted her to continue. I am offering you a teachable moment, I said. I am only asking you to try to listen with openness. I then laid out what was racially problematic about how she told the story and offered her a way to share her learning without reinforcing racist stereotypes. For the same story could easily be told and the same conclusions drawn without the racially charged imitation of the mother. She defensively interrupted me several times, but eventually appeared to be listening. Shortly after this intervention, we took a break. Several African American teachers came up to thank me, as did one white teacher who found my intervention a refreshing and much needed example of how to break white solidarity. Several white people also approached me to let me know how upset the teacher was and that she was quitting the group. Thus is the power of the good/bad binary and how it informs white fragility. Even a white person on an equity team participating in a class based on the premise that racism is structured into our society and that white complicity is an inevitable result could not handle feedback on how her racism was unintentionally manifesting itself. If you are white and have ever been challenged to look at your own racism, perhaps you told a problematic joke or made a prejudiced assumption and someone brought it to your attention, it is common to feel defensive. If you believe that you are being told you are a bad person, all your energy is likely to go toward denying this possibility and invalidating the messenger, rather than trying to understand why what you've said or done is hurtful. You will probably respond with white fragility, but unfortunately, white fragility can only protect the problematic behavior you feel so defensive about. It does not demonstrate that you are an open person who has no problematic racial behavior. The dominant paradigm of racism as discrete, individual, intentional, and malicious acts makes it unlikely that whites will acknowledge any of our actions as racism. For example, I often read about a government official, a teacher, or another public servant expressing shockingly racist statements and still insisting that he or she is not racist. Readers may recall a West Virginia county employee, Pamela Ramsey Taylor, who held a high-level position as Director of County Development and was suspended after posting racist remarks about First Lady Michelle Obama on Facebook. Quote, "It will be so refreshing to have a classy, beautiful, dignified First Lady back in the White House. I'm tired of seeing a ape in heels." The mayor of the city responded, "Just made my day, Pam." Taylor's response to the ensuing uproar was, quote, "My comment was not intended to be racist at all. I was referring to my day being made for a change in the White House. I am truly sorry for any hard feeling this may have caused. Those who know me know that I am not in any way racist." Although Taylor was suspended, but eventually got her job back, I am left wondering what actually qualifies as racism in the white mind. When I talk to white people about racism, I hear the same claims, rooted in the good/bad binary, made again and again. I organize these claims into two overall categories, both of which label the person as good and therefore not racist. The first set claims color blindness. I don't see color, and or race has no meaning to me. Therefore, I am free of racism. I'm going to read that again. The first set claims color blindness. I don't see color and or race has no meaning to me. Therefore, I am free of racism. The second set claims to value diversity. I know people of color and or have been near people of color and or have general fond regard for people of color. Therefore, I am free of racism. I'll read that again. The second set claims to value diversity. I know people of color and or have been near people of color and or have general fond regard for people of color. Therefore, I am free of racism. Both categories fundamentally rest on the good/bad binary. Although I organize these narratives into two overall categories, they can be and often are used interchangeably. They don't need to make sense. They just need to position the speaker as a good person. Free of racism, and the end of discussion. Colorblind statements insist that people do not see race, or if they see it, it has no meaning to them. Colorblind claims include the following. I was taught to treat everyone the same. I don't see color. I don't care if you are pink, purple, or polka dotted. Race doesn't have any meaning to me. My parents weren't racist, so that is why I am not racist. Everyone struggles, but if you work hard, so-and-so just happens to be black, but that has nothing to do with what I am telling you about. Focusing on race is what divides us. If people are respectful to me, I am respectful to them, regardless of race. Children today are so much more open. I'm not racist. I'm from Canada. I was picked on because I was white. I grew up poor, so I don't have race privilege. The second set of term, color celebrate. This set claims that the person sees and embraces racial difference. Color celebrate claims include statements such as, I work in a very diverse environment. I have people of color in my family, married a person of color, have children of color. I was in the military. I used to live in New York, Hawaii. We don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. I was in the Peace Corps. I marched in the 60s. We adopted a child from China. Our grandchildren are multiracial. I was on a mission in Africa. I went to a very diverse school, lived in a very diverse neighborhood. I lived in Japan and was a minority, so I know what it's like to be a minority. I lived among the fill-in-the-blank people, so I am actually a person of color. My great-grandmother was a Native American princess. In my work to unravel the dynamics of racism, I have found a question that never fails me. The question is not, is this claim true, or is it false? We will never come to an agreement on the question that sets up an either-or dichotomy on something as sensitive as racism. Instead, I ask, how does this claim function in the conversation? If we apply this question to those two sets of narratives, one colorblind and the other color celebrate, we see that all of these claims ultimately function in a similar way. They all exempt the person from any responsibility for or participation in the problem. They take race off the table, and they close, rather than open, any further exploration. In so doing, they protect the racial status quo. These typical white racial claims depend on an underlying framework of meaning. Identifying the framework can help us understand how we manage to make such claims in the context of extreme segregation and racial inequity. Imagine a pier stretching out over the water, viewed from above. The pier appears to simply float there. The top of the pier, the part that we can see, signifies the surface aspect of these claims. Yet while the pier seems to float effortlessly, it is, of course, not floating at all. It is propped up by a structure, submerged under the water. The pier rests on pillars embedded in the ocean floor. In the same way that a pier sits on the submerged pillars that are not immediately visible, the beliefs supporting our racial claims are hidden from our view. To topple the pier, we need to access and uproot the pillars. The above claims are all meant to provide evidence of the speaker's lack of racism. For example, in a conversation about racism, when white people say that they work in a diverse environment or that they have people of color in their family, they are giving me their evidence that they are not racist. If this is their evidence, how are they defining racism? In other words, what underlying system of meaning leads them to make that claim? If working near people of color is the evidence, that distinguishes them from a racist. Then evidently a racist cannot work near people of color. This claim rests on a definition of racism as conscious intolerance. A racist is someone who presumably cannot tolerate even the sight of a person of color. According to this topic, because they know or work with people of color or lived in New York where they saw people of color all around them and have spoken with them and smiled at people of color, they cannot participate in racism. When we go beneath the surface of these claims, we can see their superficiality, for even as avowed white nationalists who would march openly in the streets chanting, "Blood and soil," can interact with people of color, and very likely do so. In fact, I have seen black reporters interviewing open and avowed white supremacists on television, with both parties proceeding calmly and respectfully. Someone who claims to have been taught to treat everyone the same is simply telling me that he or she doesn't understand socialization. It is not possible to teach someone to treat everyone the same. We can be told, and often are told, to treat everyone the same, but we cannot successfully be taught to do so, because human beings are not objective. Furthermore, we wouldn't want to treat everyone the same because people have different needs and different relationships with us. Differential treatment in itself is not the problem. For example, I wouldn't give a document with a 12-point font to a person with low vision, even though someone else wouldn't have any trouble reading it. The problem is the misinformation that circulates around us and causes our differential treatment to be inequitable. The feedback I have heard reportedly from people of color is that when they hear a white person claim to have been taught to treat everyone the same, they are not thinking, "All right, I'm now talking to a woke white person." Quite the opposite. Some version of eye rolling is taking place as they sign the white person off as unaware and brace themselves for yet another exchange based in white denial and invalidation. As a culture, we don't claim the gender roles and gender conditioning disappear the moment we love someone of the opposite gender. I identify as a woman and am married to someone who identifies as a man, yet I would never say, because I am married to a man, I have a gender-free life. We understand that gender is a very deep social construct, that we have different experiences depending on our gender roles, assignments, and expressions, and that we will wrestle with these differences throughout life in our relationship. Yet when the topic is race, we claim that it is completely inoperative if there is any level of fond regard. In an even more ludicrous form of reality, we even go as far as to claim that racial conditioning disappears if we can calmly walk by people of color on the streets of large cities. While the implication that a racist could not tolerate knowing, working next to, or working among people of color is rather ridiculous, the sad fact is many whites have no cross-racial friendships at all. Perhaps this is why we rely on such flimsy evidence to certify ourselves as racism-free. But even those that have cross-racial friendships and use these as evidence of their lack of racism still invoke the binary racist. Racist equal bad, not racist equal good binary. They see their friendship as proof that they are on the not racist side of binary. Yet, cross-racial friendships do not block out the dynamics of racism in the society at large, and these dynamics continue unabated. The white person will still receive white privilege that a friend of color does not, even when the two people engage in activities together. Nor do these friendships block out all the messages that we have internalized and that are reinforced in this society. In fact, racism invariably manifests itself within cross-racial friendships as well. Racism cannot be absent from your friendship. No person of color whom I've met has said that racism isn't at play in his or her friendships with white people. Some whites are more thoughtful, aware, and receptive to feedback than others, but no cross-racial relationship is free from the dynamics of racism in the society. Many whites believe that if they are not talking about racism with their friends of color, or if their friends are not giving them feedback about racism, then racism is a non-issue. But just because you and your friends don't talk about racism does not mean it isn't at play. Indeed, this silence is one of the ways that racism is manifest, for it is an imposed silence. Many people of color have told me that they initially tried to talk about racism with their white friends, but their friends got defensive or invalidated their experiences, so they stopped sharing their experiences. If racism is not a topic of discussion between a white person and a person of color who are friends, this absence of conversation may indicate a lack of cross-racial trust. The good/binary is powerful and enduring. In what follows, I offer counter-narratives to a few of its most popular claims. Notice how each of these claims label the person making them as not racist, thereby exempting them from further involvement or responsibility. I was taught to treat everyone the same. As explained above, no one can be taught to treat people equitably, because humans cannot be 100% objective. For example, I could lecture you for hours that it is not nice to judge, that no one likes to be judged. You wouldn't want to be judged, would you? And so on. At the end of that lecture, you would still continue to judge, because it is impossible not to. We can try to examine our judgments, hold them more lightly, or so forth, but to be free of judgment? Not possible. Nor can we treat everyone the same. Indeed, the person professing to treat everyone the same is stating a value that he or she holds, but the claim closes off any further reflection. Once we understand the power of implicit bias, for example, we know that we must deepen rather than close off further reflection. Although deeper reflection won't free us from unconscious inequitable treatment of others, it will get us closer than will outright denial. I marched in the 60s. Someone who tells me that they marched in the 1960s, like the person who tells me that they know people of color, is telling me that they see racism as a simple matter of racial intolerance, which clearly they don't have, or they could not have tolerated marching alongside black people during the civil rights movement. They are also telling me that they believe that racism is uncomplicated and unchanging. Yet in the 1960s, we thought race was biological. We used terms like Oriental and colored. Nevertheless, in the light of an action they took more than 50 years ago, they see their racial learning as finished for life. Their action certifies them as free of racism, and there's no more discussion or reflection required. It also assumes that absolutely no racism, even unconsciously, has perpetrated toward blacks by well-meaning whites during the civil rights movement. Yet the testimony of black civil rights activists tells us otherwise. How many white people who marched in the 1960s had authentic cross-racial relationships with African Americans? Certainly there was, and still is, racial segregation throughout the North. 2, perhaps not as explicitly enforced, but surely enforced implicitly in countless ways. Perhaps many of those white Northerners who came down south to save black people and had some patronizing or condescending attitudes? Might many have dominated discussions, not listened to others, and assumed to know what was best? Did they say many racially problematic things that Southern blacks were forced to endure? Had I been old enough, I probably would have marched in the 1960s, and yet as far as into the 1990s, I was saying and doing racially problematic things. Although I do them less often and less blatantly today, I still do them. Again, the claim that someone is not racist because the person marched in the 1960s rests on the simplistic definition of racism as a conscious intolerance of black people. Quote, I was the minority at my school, so I was the one who experienced racism, end quote. While everyone of every race holds prejudice and can discriminate against someone of another race, in the U.S. and other white/settler nations, only white people are in the position to oppress people of color collectively and throughout the whole of society. This claim defines racism as a fluid dynamic that changes direction according to each group's ratio in a given space. While a white person may have been picked on, even mercilessly, by being in the numerical minority in a specific context, The individual was experiencing race prejudice and discrimination, not racism. This distinction is not meant to minimize the white person's experience, but aims to clarify and to prevent rendering the terms interchangeable and thus meaningless. Moreover, the society at large is still reinforcing white supremacy, and everyone in the school is affected by it. It is likely that the white students at such a school were treated better by teachers and that higher expectations were held for them. Their textbooks, the curriculum, and administration still reinforced a preference for whiteness. Outside the school, and in many aspects within it, these students were still granted white privilege as they moved through society. For most whites, being the minority in their school or neighborhood is usually temporary. They are probably no longer the minority in their environment, as upward mobility generally entails moving away from integrated spaces, or those in which people of color are the majority. Quote, my parents were not racist, and they taught me to be not racist. Whether you define racism as racial prejudices and individual acts, or as a system of racial inequality that benefits whites at the expense of people of color, as anti-racists do, your parents could not have taught you not to be racist, and your parents could not have been free of racism themselves. A racism-free upbringing is not possible because racism is a social system embedded in the culture and its institutions. We are born into this system and have no say in whether we will be affected by it. I understand that many parents tell their children to not be racist, but the practice of our lives is more powerful than the words we say, and living a segregated life is a powerful message of practice. Of course, there are degrees, and it is certainly more constructive to be told that racism is wrong rather than right. But that is still not enough to completely inoculate us from the culture at large. Let's imagine what the person really meant. Let's imagine that what the person really meant was this, quote, my parents were not racially prejudiced, and they taught me not to be racially prejudiced. This statement would still be false because it is not humanly possible to be free of prejudice. This statement simply indicates that the person is uneducated about the socialization process and the inescapable dynamics of human culture. A person's parents might have said that they were not prejudiced and thus denied their prejudice. They may have told their children that they should not be prejudiced, the results being that, like their parents, the children deny their prejudice. The parents may have sincerely hoped and believed that they were raising their children not to be prejudiced. But we can't teach humans to have no prejudice at all. The human brain just does not work that way as we process information about others. Most of us only teach our children not to admit to prejudice. A parent training a child not to say certain things that are overtly racist is teaching the child self-censorship, rather than how to examine the deeply embedded racial messages we all absorb. Ideally, we would teach our children how to recognize and challenge prejudice rather than deny it. Children today are so much more open. And that was a quote. As for the claim that children are so much more open, research over the past 2 decades indicates that children are vastly more sophisticated in their awareness of racial hierarchies than most people believe. Even when race is not explicitly discussed, children internalize both implicit and explicit messages about it from their environment. For example, psychology researchers Maria Montero, Delilah De Franca, and Ricardo Rodriguez tested 283 white children aged 6 to 7 and 9 to 10 years old. The children were asked to allocate money to white and black children, sometimes with a white adult in the room and sometimes with no adult in the room at all, to see if having an adult present influenced their behavior. The researchers found that the younger group discriminated against black children in both conditions, while the older group discriminated against the black children only when no adult was present. This finding is significant because it shows that the older children clearly had racial prejudice and acted on it, but hid it when a white adult was present. Thus, the children showed that they did not become less racially biased with age, but that they had learned to hide their racism in front of adults. Monteiro and her colleagues found racial hostility in white children as young as 3 years old. However, most white parents and teachers believe that children are colorblind. This false belief keeps us from honestly addressing racism with children and exploring with them how racism has shaped the inequities that they already observe. Race has nothing to do with it. That's also a quote. How often have we heard someone preface a story about race with the statement, "Race has nothing to do with this, but," or "she just happened to be black," and let's look closer at why the person feels that it is necessary to make this opening point, as it usually illustrates just the opposite. The racist equal bad / not racist equal good binary is reflected in these statements because according to the binary, if race has anything to do with it, then the person telling the story would be racially implicated and thus no longer positioned as colorblind or outside race. Further, if the story is about a conflict between the storyteller and a person of color, then the storyteller might sound racist, and that would mean that the speaker is a bad person. If, however, the speaker understands racism as an institutional system into which we are all socialized, then he or she wouldn't make this disclaimer because the person understands that the conflict cannot be free of racial dimensions. We bring our racial histories with us, and contrary to the ideology of individualism, we represent our groups and those who have come before us. Our identities are not unique or inherent, but constructed or produced through social processes. What's more, we don't see through clear or objective eyes. We see through racial lenses. On some level, race is always at play, even in its supposed absence. Quote, "Focusing on race is what divides us." The idea that talking about racism is itself racist has always struck me to be odd. It is rooted in the concept that race doesn't matter. Thus, to talk about it gives it undeserved weight. Many things that we talk about every day don't really matter. Precisely because these topics of conversation don't matter, they are easy to talk about. We know race matters a great deal, but for many of the reasons already discussed, we feel the need to deny its importance. Ironically, this denial is a fundamental way in which white people maintain unequal racial power. I have heard this response many times in the context of cross-racial discussions, most often at the point in which white racial power is named. Many whites see the naming of white racial power as divisive. For them, the problem is not the power inequity itself, the problem is naming the power inequity. This naming breaks the pretense of unity and exposes the reality of social division. Even though participants of color repeatedly state that whites' refusal to acknowledge racial difference and power dynamics actually maintains racial inequity, white participants continue to insist that not talking about difference is necessary for unity. Although the participants are purportedly engaged in these discussions to explore differences in racial perspectives and experiences, as soon as these differences appear, many whites react as if there has been a violation. Of course, white norms are violated by naming white power, but unequal power relations cannot be challenged if they are not acknowledged. Refusing to engage in an authentic exploration of racial realities erases and denies alternate racial experiences. If we block out other realities by not discussing them, we can pretend that they don't exist, thereby assuming a shared racial experience. Not talking about race allows us to maintain our sense of ourselves as unique individuals, outside collective socialization and group experience. While it isn't comfortable for most whites to talk about racism, we must do so if we want to challenge rather than protect racism. To avoid talking about racism can only hold our misinformation in place and prevent us from developing the necessary skills and perspectives to challenge the status quo. In conclusion, most of us alive before and during the 1960s have had images from the civil rights conflicts of that time held up as the epitome of racism. Today we have images of white nationalists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, to hold up. And while speaking up against these explicitly racist actions is critical, we must also be careful not to use them to keep ourselves on the, quote, good side of a false binary. I have found it much more useful to think of myself as a continuum. Racism is so deeply woven into the fabric of our society, and I do not see myself escaping from that continuum in my life, but I can continually seek to move further along it. I am not in a fixed position on the continuum. My position is dictated by what I am actually doing at a given time. Conceptualizing myself on an active continuum changes the question from whether I am or am not racist to a much more constructive question. Am I actively seeking to interpret racism in this context? And perhaps, even more importantly, how do I know? The end. Thank you for watching.